The Bavarian Soviet Republic briefly existed in 1919 before being incorporated into the Weimar Republic, but had it survived, the world could have changed significantly. While this is not too realistic to happen, the consequences would be massive, as for example, I don't see Germany to initiate the Anschluss, as they would barely border the Austrians, nor do I see the Munich Conference happening in the exactly same way, so the Second World War would be greatly altered. This is how the world could have changed had the Bavarian Soviet Republic survived. The history of the Bavarian Soviet Republic is brief, but I find it really interesting. Many things went wrong for them, so I want to tell you how it's possible, or at least more likely, for them to survive and to establish a communist state in the south of Germany, which would be deeply allied with the Soviet Union. On the 8th of November 1918, the People's State of Bavaria was established, which did remain as part of Germany, following the unrest of the German Revolution of 1918-1919 and the collapse of the central government, but also the establishment of the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Munich was encouraged to go down the Soviet path. Thus, the Bavarian Soviet Republic was proclaimed, with the People's State of Bavaria fleeing to Bamberg. But the new state was not successful, as the government had no political or administrative experience, sort of like every Eastern European country today. These are the territories that they claimed, but in reality, they only controlled just Munich and some parts of the countryside, which are difficult to map out. The Bavarian people were actually opposed to the Soviet Republic, as according to everyone, Bavaria was the least likely place in Germany to become communist. The people there were mostly conservative, so they preferred a king, which was against the aims of the Soviet Republic. The people were also deeply Catholic, which was also against the aims of the Soviet Republic. In fact, one of Munich's main churches was taken over and made into a revolutionary temple, further antagonizing the Bavarian Catholics. The Bavarian Soviet Republic made many mistakes that angered the people that they controlled. For example, they antagonized the conservatives by electing a convicted burglar as police president of Munich. To add insult to injury, the Commissar of Foreign Affairs was admitted several times into psychiatric hospitals. He even went as far as to declare war on Württemberg and Switzerland, which was not taken seriously, as his government was unrecognized. He declared war on Switzerland as they refused to lend 60 locomotives to the Soviet Republic, which angered Dr. Franz Lipp so much that he wanted to declare war. Now that you can make sense of the people who were running this government, you may now understand why it only lasted 27 days. This government of convicted criminals and psychopaths was quickly ousted, and it even lasted only 6 days, with the German Communist Party replacing them, and Eugene Levin, a Russian-German Bolshevik, took charge, implementing more radical version of communism. It is after that when the Bavarian Red Army was formed, as it knew that the central government would attack them, so the Bavarians would need to fight for their independence. This army was formed from factory workers, which increased the worsening food shortage in the newly established state. All workers would also receive military training. All of this was funded by seizing cash, food supplies and privately owned guns. Aristocrats and middle-class members were arrested and taken as hostages, following the orders of Lenin. This, bundled with the massive food shortages, made the Bavarian Soviet Republic extremely unpopular with its inhabitants. While the exiled Bavarian Prime Minister Johannes Hoffmann called for all Bavarians to volunteer in the army and aid in the destruction of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which he described as being terrorized by Russians. This was decently successful, and people joined the government forces, which was planning to march on Munich and reincorporate Bavaria into Germany. Both sides clashed at Dachau, just on the outskirts of Munich. It was 8,000 soldiers loyal to Hoffmann against the Soviet Republic's 30,000. It was the first and only victory for the Bavarian Red Army, as after that Johannes Hoffmann was given 20,000 Freikorps troops to serve his cause. The Freikorps applied brutal methods and killed everyone who stood in their way, which unnecessarily increased the death toll. These soldiers took Dachau and surrounded Munich, and later they advanced to take the city. The fighting was brutal, as included flamethrowers, heavy artillery, armored vehicles and even an aircraft. The Bavarian Soviet Republic thus collapsed and its members were imprisoned or eliminated. This put an end to the socialist experiment and the Hoffmann government returned, forming the Free State of Bavaria within the new Weimar Republic. Considering all of this, I think that it's fair to say that somehow the Bavarian Soviet Republic managed to do everything wrong. So to make sure that they survive, I would need to do exactly the opposite of what they did historically. The first step to increase the odds of the Bavarian Soviet Republic to survive is to not hire convicted criminals and to try to appease the people instead, which would be a step in the right direction. This means that the more radical cabinet of Eugene Levin would take charge as soon as possible. The second reform I would have them implement is to not immediately antagonize the Catholics, but to work with them and only later repress them. Ensuring the support of the Catholics would be very beneficial, as they controlled most of the countryside, which could improve the food shortage situation. Thirdly, Eugene Levin should also work more closely with the German Communist Party, as ensuring their support could be the difference between life and death. The Communist Party of Germany wasn't popular at all in 1919, as historically, in the 1920 federal election, they only got 2.1% of the vote. But in 1924, just 4 years later, they increased this number to 12.6%, so their support would grow dramatically in the 1921-1923 Weimar crisis. The final reform I would have them do as to ensure that the Bavarian Soviet Republic survives is for the Weimar Republic not to ally with the Freikorps, which was an uncontrollable paramilitary organization. As I said earlier, the Freikorps unleashed chaos and terror on its own population. The Freikorps increased drastically the death toll during the retaking of Munich, as any civilians suspected of being communist or anarchists were freely executed. The Weimar Republic not using them is not too insane to consider, as the Spartakist uprising happened just 3 months prior to the establishment of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. In the Spartakist uprising, the Weimar Republic also used the Freikorps to put the rebellion down, which was successful, but the Freikorps eliminated in brutal ways a lot of innocent civilians. In this alternate timeline, the Weimar government decides not to send in the Freikorps, as they fear that they'd cause chaos in Munich, which would antagonize the Bavarians and make them resist the state's entry into the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic would also try to disband the Freikorps, as they pretty much acted on their own and could pose a threat to the Weimar Republic's longevity. The exact numbers are impossible to find, but the Freikorps had around 500,000 men being directly involved, which were more of the army of the Weimar Republic, so the Freikorps could carry out a coup and perhaps be successful. For these two reasons, I'd have the Weimar Republic not to send in the Freikorps to deal with the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which would be a grave mistake for them. Historically, as I said earlier, the Hoffmann Loyalists and the Bavarian Red Army clashed at Dachau, where the Bavarians were victorious. But then, Johannes Hoffmann was given 20,000 Freikorps troops to serve his cause, which then successfully destroyed the Bavarian Soviet Republic. With the reforms I just suggested, the Bavarian Soviet Republic could be way more competent, but also without them fighting the Freikorps, they would secure their own state. As I said, the Soviet Republic would befriend the Catholics initially, so the countryside would be more in support of the new state. As such, I can see the Bavarian Soviet Republic to consolidate the countryside and take their claimed territory. They already fielded an army of 30,000 workers, so they could challenge the Weimar Republic. What I expect to happen is for the Bavarian Soviet Republic to slowly expand out of Munich and into the countryside, which would alleviate the food shortages, as farms would most likely be privatized. By the time that the Weimar Republic could field an army to defeat the Bavarian Soviet Republic, the Weimar crisis would occur. In 1921, the Weimar Republic entered an economical crisis, which soon resulted in hyperinflation. Then all went wrong for the Weimar Republic, as they repeatedly missed reparation payments. This was followed up by France and Belgium to jointly occupy the Ruhr, where was located a solid chunk of the German industry, population, coal and other raw materials. What happens after that is not important, but I think that this incident could happen a lot sooner, perhaps in early 1920. This means that from April 1919, when the Bavarian Soviet Republic was created, to this alternate Ruhr crisis in early 1920 is only 1 year. If the Bavarian Soviet Republic manages to survive for just a year, which is more likely if the Weimar Republic doesn't employ the Freikorps, most likely they will secure their own state when the Ruhr crisis happens. This is because the Weimar government was already into huge debt and got their lands occupied by France once again, so the people would prefer to let Bavaria do its own thing and instead to reclaim the Ruhr. The Weimar Republic cannot justify spending a lot of money to defeat the Bavarian Soviet Republic, while the hyperinflation crisis is still ongoing. So, if the Bavarian Soviet Republic manages to survive just a year after they were created, they will most likely consolidate power and take their claimed territories eventually, but this would exclude the Palatinate, as France would never allow a communist state on their doorstep. I know this may be slightly unrealistic, but them realistically surviving is really difficult, as the country only lasted for 27 days, while being led by convicted criminals, and ruling over people that had opposite views of the government. Still, I don't think that this is too insane to consider, and I believe that my point of divergence of not sending in the Freikorps and waiting for the Ruhr crisis is actually reasonable. There is the possibility of France invading the Bavarian Soviet Republic, as this new state wouldn't be giving war reparations to France. But I think that this is unlikely considering the French political situation. They wouldn't be willing to enter into another war for any reason. So, the Bavarian Soviet Republic would be successfully established and consolidate their lands in 1921, which is even before the Soviet Union finishes with their civil war. Munich could become the first capital of the communist world, and then, perhaps in 1924, it would become Leningrad. The Soviet Union and the Bavarian Soviet Republic historically coordinated a lot. Some of Lenin's orders were acted upon in Bavaria, so they were very close. The country would be ruled by Eugene Levin, who is a Russian German, which would further improve relations between the two. This communist state in the center of Europe would be a thorn in everyone's side, as it lacks any real allies. Of course, the Soviet Union is a big supporter of the country, but they are nowhere close to it. So if the Weimar Republic were to attack it, the Soviet Union cannot help it in any way, as they don't border either of these countries. As such, the Bavarian Soviet Republic would be pretty much isolated, and I have no doubt that some countries would embargo them and choose to seize their trade, at least in the beginning, right after their establishment. I want to go down south and tell you what would happen to Austria, as I see their history changing quite a lot as a result of that. Right after the conclusion of the Great War, Austria-Hungary collapsed, and from its ashes the Republic of German Austria emerged, with these claimed territories. Their goal was to secure their independence and these territories, and then to unite with Germany, but this was prohibited in the Treaty of Versailles. In practice, they controlled only a tiny chunk of these claimed territories, as the Sudetenland was controlled by Czechoslovakia, with South Tyrol being administered by Italy, and Yugoslavia controlling northern Slovenia. The Austrians wanted to unite with Germany, as after the dissolution of Austria-Hungary, the Austrian portion was left in ruins. Their industry was now in Czechoslovakia, their food supplies were now in Hungary, and their coastline was controlled by Yugoslavia, so the Austrian state was hit particularly hard. As such, they sought to unite with Germany and improve their domestic situation. I am mentioning this because there is a slight possibility that Austria chooses to unite with the Bavarian Soviet Republic. In the 1920 Austrian legislative election, the Social Democratic Party of Austria won 35.99% of the votes. They were the main supporters of the idea that Austria should join the Weimar Republic. The Social Democratic Party of Austria is the exact same in terms of ideology of the German SPD, or Social Democratic Party of Germany, which ruled the Weimar Republic, so it makes sense for these ideologically similar places with a shared language to want to unite. This time, with the Bavarian Soviet Republic in the picture, the politics of Austria may inevitably change. It is possible that the Austrians want to unite with the Bavarians and be equal partners, but not many would wish to be part of a Soviet Republic. Austria joining the Bavarian Soviet Republic isn't too insane to consider, as Vienna during that time period was commonly referred as Red Vienna, due to the reign of the Social Democratic Party of Austria. The thing is that in the early 1920s, both the Weimar Republic and Austria were doing extremely bad economically, while I assumed the Bavarian Soviet Republic would be doing a little bit better. For example, they wouldn't have to pay any war reparations, but they can receive Soviet aid and become wealthier than the Weimar Republic and Austria. Of course, this is because in 1923, the Weimar Republic was suffering one of the biggest economic crises in the world. So it's not to say that the Bavarian Soviet Republic would be doing well economically, just their neighboring countries would be doing worse compared to them. But of course, the Weimar Republic would later transition into the Third Reich, with the appointment of a person who looks just like this cat as the Chancellor of Germany. Or would they? Germany is perhaps less likely to go ultranationalist, but I think that this would still happen. But the ultranationalists are going to be way weaker. Let me explain why. Historically, after the Bavarian Soviet Republic was defeated, the people there became strongly anti-communist. As I explained earlier, that the convicted criminals led the country, declared wars and caused a famine. The Bavarians became not only strongly anti-communist, but the state also became a breeding ground for far-right ideology, such as the National Socialists. Additionally, after the socialist incident, there was a split in the left-leaning parties, so this weakened the opposition that allowed the National Socialists to quickly rise to power. This graph visualizes how quickly the National Socialists actually rose to power. This time it would be a lot different. The Nazis may still rise to power, but the process will be perhaps slightly longer. This is one take on the issue, but the other take is that the National Socialists may rise and take over Germany at around the same time. Due to this cut hating communism and Jews, where the Bavarian Soviet Republic was communist and administered by a lot of Jews, the cut can promise to destroy this nation and incorporate them into Germany, while punishing the people involved. The Austrian painter would blame the downfall of the Weimar Republic on the Bavarian Soviet Republic, saying that the Weimar government missed a payment to France in 1922 because they were busy fighting the Bavarians. So he would claim that Bavaria caused the Weimar crisis of hyperinflation, at least according to this cut, which we know wouldn't be true. So, with the Bavarian Soviet Republic's existence, the National Socialists either become less popular or more popular, and I think that both theories are correct, so I would love to hear your opinion in the comments. For the sake of this video, I would have these to cancel out, so the German state would become ultra-nationalist at around the same time as it did in our timeline, just Bavaria exists and is communist. After that, all would happen in exactly the same way, but I don't see Germany coming close to the July push in the summer of 1934, where they almost got control over Austria. So Engelbert Dollfuss would never be assassinated and would remain in charge. In 1935, the Germans would still take the Saarland via a referendum, and the next year they would remilitarize the Rhineland, so Germany is becoming an expansionist power. Going down to Austria, they initially wanted to unite with Germany for a better quality of life, but they didn't want to be part of that Germany. As such, some would call for Austria to unite with Bavaria, and here I would split the scenario into two parts, one where this does happen and another where the Austrians remain independent. As for the scenario where Austria remains independent, I think that Germany would find it impossible to do the Anschluss for several reasons, one of which is Engelbert Dollfuss, who was never assassinated. Another reason is that the two countries almost don't border each other. The third reason is that the Germans are weaker in this alternate universe, so they cannot practically invade Austria and establish a fake referendum to annex the country. As such, the German High Command would realize that they would need to deal with Bavaria before they set their sights on Austria and Czechoslovakia, not to speak of Poland and later France. As the ideology of the German High Command was one of eradicating communism and the Jews, which is basically the Bavarian Soviet Republic, these countries would become natural enemies. So a war between the two can become a reality in 1936 or 1937. The thing is that the German Reich was just starting to remilitarize, so in 1937 they still aren't the beast that they became just 4 years after that. As such, I can see the Germans having trouble with their Bavarian enemy, who would receive help from the Soviet Union via Italy and Austria. The Italians are the protectors of the Austrians, and they would realize that if Bavaria falls, that Austria would be next, so they would briefly support Bavaria. France and Britain may see that Germany is violating the Treaty of Versailles by going over the agreed 100,000 soldiers limit. There may never be appeasement, and France can take the Ruhr once again and occupy it up until the war is over. As to add insult to injury, the German Chancellor is not immune to assassinations or counter-revolutions, as the Oster conspiracy may still take place. Basically, nobody really trusted the German Führer just yet, and some in the army may believe that by invading Austria this would lead to war with France and Britain. Obviously, we can't know for certain exactly what would happen, so I will stick to what happened historically, but with a few changes. For the final time, I want to tell you that this is not realistic and please don't take it seriously. I would say that Germany still defeats the Bavarian Soviet Republic and incorporates them, while committing a brief genocide against the communists, anarchists and Jews there. After that, the Germans may attempt a similar operation to the July push in 1934 of our own history, with the goal to get Austria as a protectorate. The plans of the German Führer was never to directly annex Austria, but historically, when the Anschluss happened, and he went across the border to visit his birthplace in Austria, the people there were very enthusiastic, throwing flowers and welcoming the National Socialists. This then encouraged the Germans that they should directly annex Austria. Having this in mind, the Germans would want to restore the Republic of German Austria, so they would boost the party's ideology in Austria, while preparing to invade. Italy would be the only great power that could have saved Austria, but since the Italians invaded and annexed Ethiopia, their relations with the former Entente, which were France and Britain, would be destroyed. Thus the Italians would want to unite with Germany instead, so they can potentially throw Austria under the bus. I see something similar to happen to this scenario, but the Austrians would never be annexed by the Germans, they would simply become a puppet state. The year of this alternate Anschluss may be 1939, so the Third Reich is already a year behind schedule, which would have several implications. Then the Germans would demand the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and in the Munich Conference I can see it going in exactly the same way, as France and Britain still weren't ready for war, with Czechoslovakia not being invited and able to have an opinion. This alternate Munich Conference may happen in late 1939 or early 1940. It would be resolved in Germany's favor, which would grant the Sudetenland to Austria, as it was claimed by them historically during the days of the Republic of German Austria, which I mentioned earlier. After that, the Germans may be wary of taking the rest of Czechoslovakia, as France and Britain are starting to mobilize and getting ready to go to war. Still, I expect Germany to potentially initiate a Slovak rebellion and then to take out the Bohemian and Moravian parts. This is, by the way, extremely optimistic, but considering how stubborn the Allies were, I think it's not too insane to consider. Of course, the most logical step for the Allies was to stop Germany at the Munich Conference, so France would never capitulate. But we have the power of hindsight, so please keep this in mind. After that, Germany would still attack Poland, but perhaps in mid-1940 or even worse, early 1941. This would have catastrophic consequences, as the Allies are more prepared, but also the Soviet Union has completed its Great Purge, and is significantly stronger. In this alternate universe, everybody but Germany would be stronger. Still, I expect the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to deal with Poland swiftly, as France would be too stubborn to leave their expensive fortifications and attack the undefended Rhineland. The French may be a little more prepared for a war with Germany, but still I expect them to fall. Just remember that I'm being optimistic towards Germany, and I am following what happened historically. Then the Italians would join the war together with Germany, which would consolidate the Balkans, but the year would already be 1943. This means that if Germany wants to attack the Soviet Union, they would have to do it about a year and a half later, compared to our own history, which would go as well as you would expect. I have no doubt that the National Socialists of Germany are stupid enough to initiate this war, but even if they don't, I'm sure that the Soviet Union would attack Germany either way. No matter how this war starts, the Soviet Union doesn't suffer from the Great Purge and the year is 1943, so they are way more prepared. Thus, I don't expect to see similar losses of life and territory on the Soviet side. Soon the tides of the war will turn against Germany, and while the Allies are fighting in Africa and scrambling to organize forces to do Operation Overlord, also known as D-Day, the Soviets would be advancing deep into Germany, perhaps taking Berlin in 1944. By the time the Allies do find a way to land in Europe, it would be already too late. Once the Soviet Union reaches Bavaria, they would restore the Bavarian Soviet Republic and hold a lot of influence in the new nation. Still, I expect the Allies to liberate France and meet the Soviets in Germany at around 1945. But then the Americans, who I assume would still be in this war due to Japan, would drop their atomic bomb on some German city, and then another one. These are the consequences for Germany if the war was delayed by a year and a half, just like how I predicted. And with that, the Second World War would end in a catastrophic German defeat. Europe would be redrawn into spheres of influence, which would be more favorable to the Soviet Union, due to the Allies landing later in Europe and not holding a lot of territory. As for Eastern Europe, I assume it would go pretty identical, but the meat of the video is Germany, where the Soviet Union would conquer a lot of the country and establish the German Democratic Republic, with the Bavarian Soviet Republic taking the Palatinate. The Allies, on the other hand, would only be able to take the Rhineland and establish the German Federation, with France still taking the Saarland. As for Austria, they were historically occupied just like the Germans were and allowed to reunite in 1955, if they promised to remain a neutral nation. This time, it wouldn't happen, as the Soviets would occupy most, if not all of Austria, but even go down into South Tyrol. Thus, I can see the Austrians to become a Soviet satellite, which would gain all of South Tyrol at the expense of Italy. This would result in these borders, and the Soviet Union would be in a way stronger position, but the Western democratic countries I think are still stronger than the Eastern communist states. Still, this could be considered the beginning of a red world, as the Soviet Union could help China win the civil war. But also, most likely North Korea would unite the Korean peninsula. Then the domino effect would start in Southeast Asia, turning more and more countries communist. Let me know if you want to see a part 2 of this scenario. This scenario can go on forever, but I want to go back to 1936 and briefly explore a scenario in which Austria joins with the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which to me is more fascinating. This is even less likely to happen, but it would have changed the Great War drastically. Engelbert Dollfuss would of course be opposed to Austria joining Bavaria, but some communist sympathizers can simply eliminate him and the new government would vote to join Bavaria, as they would have a better standard of living there. This is, let me remind you, really unlikely. This is because it is completely neglecting the Italian position on the matter, but let me continue. So, Germany would inevitably try to take down the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which likely gets renamed to the South German Soviet Republic, but they would meet even more resistance. This can potentially mean that the ultranationalist Germans struggle to conquer the South German Soviet Republic. This is because the war would happen at around 1938, so the ultranationalist Germans were still very weak. But in this alternate universe, they are even weaker in 1938, and their army would be even more pathetic. As such, the Austro conspiracy may fire, where the army would take over and dismantle the ultranationalist dictatorship, perhaps even bringing back the monarchy under Wilhelm III. The South German Soviet state would emerge victorious and can take the Palatinate, which was part of Bavaria, but also Württemberg and Hohenzollern can be forced to join the South German Soviet Republic, as to establish connection between the Palatinate and mainland Bavaria. This scenario fascinates me more as it prevents the Second World War from happening, but this is not to say that the world is any more stable. The Weimar Republic could also be restored again, instead of bringing Wilhelm III. So if you wonder what if the Weimar Republic survived, I would redirect you to this video, where you can find the answer. Thank you for watching and I wish you the best day possible. Goodbye.